Hello. The chief antagonists that are trying to destroy the rediscovery of Noah's Ark comprise individuals that are associated with the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a Marxist revolutionary terrorist organization that is renowned for killing civilians, especially women and children, in order to destabilize the government of Turkey. Also, there are individuals that are trying to denigrate the Ark that have significant ties to the Yazidi community. These are the early brand of Satanists that worship a Melek Taus, or the peacock angel, that many in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism ascribe to the devil. Also, secularists and secular academics are very against Noah's Ark discovery, simply because it threatens their majority and dominance over Western thought. Secularism and atheism are totally in control of academia in the West. The fourth group that is trying to denigrate and destroy Noah's Ark has a history of animosity with the rediscoverer of Noah's Ark, namely Ahmed Ertugrul. First, Randall Price. Randall not only allegedly was physically humiliated by Ahmed Ertugrul in front of his son, but then Ahmed Ertugrul took him to a place that was far away from Noah's Ark, and then allegedly stole up to $30,000 from Randall Price. But instead of taking his animosity out on Ahmed Ertugrul, Randall Price has tried to destroy the archaeological site, Noah's Ark, and the artifactual assemblage in Noah's Ark. For example, at the very beginning, Randall Price said that artifacts were removed from Noah's Ark, and this was totally correct. But then he reversed course, and he said, oh, no, Noah's Ark represents a fraud, which enabled Ahmed Ertugrul to remove more artifacts from the site. Now, these were all reported to the Turkish government, but this has caused a needless delay in terms of the protection, preservation, and research of Noah's Ark. The second individual is Richard Bright, or Dick Bright. And the reason is, many years ago, Dick and Ahmed Ertugrul were allegedly accosted by Turkish Jandarma Militarici, thinking that they were PKK, and they were fired upon. Dick Bright has resentment toward Ahmed Ertugrul for nearly losing his life. But again, instead of taking out their animosity on Ahmed Ertugrul, they've taken it out on this defenseless archaeological site, namely Noah's Ark. The third person that's involved in this, Don Patton. Don Patton is an individual that is said that he's friends with Randall and friends with Dick. As he said himself, he's going to do whatever they want him to do. But in this case, they're using him to destroy and denigrate a wonderful archaeological site. The fourth person that's involved is an individual named Murat Sahin. He was convicted and spent 10 years in prison for cutting off the ear of a disabled man, and then killing his father, and then shooting the jaw off another individual. And for this, he spent 10 years in a Turkish penitentiary. But again, instead of being very wary of this criminality, this group has been totally used by Murat Sahin to give him money to go on a wild goose chase around Greater Mount Ararat, being nowhere near the southern gorge, which is the actual location of Noah's Ark. And finally, you have a group of young Earth creationists that are very against this rediscovery and are trying to destroy the site because it interferes with their marketing of their replica arks. It threatens to expose some of their views and inaccuracies now that the real Ark has been rediscovered. As an archaeologist, the fact that Noah's Ark was largely unprotected put me and others in a difficult position, because if we expose their lies too much, These groups could hurt the archaeological site that was unprotected, steal artifacts from Noah's Ark, and exchange the artifacts for weapons to kill Turkish civilians and facilitate terrorism and a Marxist revolution within Turkey. But now the site is protected, and I and others are able to address the lies, false allegations, and misleading tactics these groups use and used to destroy and denigrate Noah's Ark. So all groups are working in conjunction and are offering 10 lies which are used to denigrate and destroy this precious archaeological site that represents not only Noah's Ark, a foundational belief in 3 world religions, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also represents the transition point between the end of the Stone Age or the Late Epipaleolithic. The site is from 13,100 to 9,600 BC, and the origin or the progenitor site of the Neolithic or the farming age, precisely the beginning of the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. Noah's Ark is located in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat, between 3,900 and 4,700 meters above sea level, 4 to 11 meters under the surface of the gorge. It is 158 meters in length. It certainly is Noah's Ark. First of all, the interior is filled with cages for animals and also perches for the birds, anywhere from 20 centimeters in width to over 4 meters in width. There are thousands of cages for animals and also perches for the birds. And we know this from the non-skeletal remains, the feces, the hair, the fur, from every type of animal, mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and insects. There's thousands of animal tracks of every type of animal. Also in the interior of the barge, there's a small habitations for very few humans. And one of the notable characteristics is all the furniture is adhered to the walls. There's no free-floating furniture. It's all attached to the walls, similar to modern barges or other vessels, to prevent the furniture from being a safety issue during rough seas. This archaeological site is covered on the exterior and on the interior with bitumen or petroleum-based pitch and also cypress sap, similar to early Neolithic vessels at the Kuwaiti site of Asabia during the early Neolithic. Also, this site is definitely a maritime barge, in that the exterior of the hull angles inward to the central keel. Also, many walls angle inward toward the central keel. You also have the seafaring woods of Cupressa sempervirens, Mediterranean cypress, oak, and teak. Another example is that the site is built with the use of stone adzes. Also, in the maritime barge is 3 decks. Barnacles are found on the exterior of the hull. There's a lot of cross beams throughout the different elevations of the walls to keep the hull intact. Also, there's lots of evidence for maritime joinery, specifically coak-and-dowel or mortise-and-tenon joinery throughout the vessel. In addition, the barge has large cargo holds that are filled with early types of legumes, namely cicer, chickpea, pisum, pea, and vicia urvilia, or bitter vetch, which is not common today, but was very common during the transition between the late Epipaleolithic and the pre-pottery Neolithic. The huge cargo holds are lined with bundles of wattle, tree stems, also lined with clay to act as an early desiccant to prevent moisture from building up in the cargo holds. Another feature is the sloping ramps that lead up and down to the thousands of cages for the different types of animals, and also the perches for the birds. And here there's an archaeobotanical assemblage that is just stunning, representing all the proto and pre-domesticated forms of the cereal grains that comprise the late Epipaleolithic, early Neolithic diet. The site accommodates all the requirements, all the criteria that are mentioned in Genesis, chapters 5 through 10, and also by the Babylonian scholar Berosus. Now that the site has been separated, it was 158 meters when it was together, but is now in an area that covers 2 stadia in width and 5 stadia in length, following the requirements of the Babylonian scholar Berosus. Also, according to Josephus, a Jewish Roman historian, Noah's Ark is braced with cross beams throughout the interior and has plenty of evidence for bitumen on the vessel, which Josephus says is that people took the little bits of bitumen to make little talismans during classical times. The site also fulfills one of the mentions in an account associated with Alexander the Great, in that during the summer, the site is located in the midst of an expanse of water when the glacial ice melts in pools at the bottom of the highest plateau in the southern gorge. Also in the Qur'an, Muhammad mentions the vessel confronted waves as high as mountains. And it's interesting that all along both the starboard and port side, there are ballast features comprising horizontal cypress timbers in front of a linear mass of boulders, but these boulders are from the Levant and comprise sandstone and coral and other sedimentary rock that are totally different from the volcanic lithic material from Greater Mount Ararat. So not only does this site fulfill all the requirements for a maritime barge, but it also fulfills all the requirements in classical archaeology from these ancient texts from Genesis, Berosus, Josephus, Muhammad, and also by a text associated with Alexander the Great. So all of these show very clearly that this archaeological site is Noah's Ark. So let's talk about the top 10 lies that are used by these groups to try to destroy and denigrate the rediscovery of Noah's Ark and inhibit its preservation, its protection, and its research. The third terrible lie used to destroy Noah's Ark and denigrate its features and its artifacts is that this site represents an ice cave. This is a flat-out lie. Some of the archaeological contexts, especially on the southern end where there has been tremendous decomposition, are covered at certain times with water from the melting glacier. And this covers the intact archaeological loci or contexts with an ice cover as the weather gets colder on Greater Mount Ararat and freezes over. But Area A1, which is the best preserved area of Noah's Ark, shows no ice cover. These are perfectly preserved under many layers of the interior of Noah's Ark, culminating with the hull of the vessel, which angles inward. So these are not ice caves. These are large archaeological loci. Locus 8 measures over 12 meters, making it the most ancient and the largest archaeological context, even greater than the pre-pottery Neolithic tower at Jericho. So this is a wonderful archaeological site and in no way an ice cave. Now, part of this is the only effort that I'm aware of to gaslight an archaeological site. to denigrate it subtly by half-truths. The fact of the matter is that for millennia, people dug from the surface of the gorge to form tunnels to entrances near Noah's Ark where they could worship and leave votive objects. And here they dug through layers of ice and lithic material in order to get to these little worship areas outside apertures where they could see into Noah's Ark but not go into Noah's Ark. But these don't represent the actual structure itself, but tunnels that were dug by various cultures in order to venerate Noah's Ark from 9600 BC to 1907, where these tunnels were filled at the direction of the Catholicos Gremian, and then many of the artifacts were moved to what is now the Republic of Georgia. Also, there are actual caves on the eastern side of the site that are not associated physically with Noah's Ark, which is at the bottom of the southern gorge of greater Mount Ararat. These caves are actual caves. They're not covered with ice. They're not covered with snow. But what they represent is the early locations where Noah and his family initially lived, because what we have is some of the artifacts from the interior of Noah's Ark being transported to these caves on the eastern side of the gorge, which provided a temporary habitation for Noah and his family to supervise debarkation of the animals and themselves off the ark. So this idea that the site represents an ice cave is not only a total lie, but the only archaeological form of gaslighting them I'm aware of, because what they're trying to do is trying to simplify and denigrate the site, when in fact we have three factors. Number one, tunnels that were dug by later cultures from the surface of the gorge to these small worship areas outside apertures that peer into Noah's Ark, where people could worship and venerate the ark, which is filled with animal feces and completely utilitarian and dates from the late Stone Age. Number two, there are caves on the eastern side of the gorge that represent the earliest habitations for Noah and his family to supervise debarkation off the ark. And we know this because the artifacts on the ark resemble these artifacts in these caves. Number three, some of the archaeological contexts, especially on the southern end where there has been tremendous decomposition, are covered at certain times with water from the melting glacier. And this covers the intact loci or context with an ice cover as the weather gets colder on greater Mount Ararat and freezes over. Again, Noah's Ark does not represent ice caves, but a wonderful archaeological structure from the late Stone Age. Ultimately, these lies will be exposed. These individuals that comprise Marxist revolutionaries, devil-worshipping communities, hardcore academic secularists and atheists, and young earth creationists trying to preserve their market share of Ark replicas will fail. You can cancel people, you can cancel ideas, but you can't cancel a 158-meter barge from the late Epipaleolithic period, buried 4 to 11 meters under the surface of greater Mount Ararat between 3,900 and 4,700 meters above sea level. And ultimately, this sign for the ages, as mentioned in the Qur'an, or this sign that represents, just as in the days of Noah, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be, the return of God, cannot be hidden, cannot be lied about. My personal aim is to ensure that this site is protected, preserved, researched, and promoted throughout the entire world and becomes the world's worst kept secret in archaeology. And I hope you do your part to protect, preserve, research, and promote the rediscovery of Noah's Ark, a site that is valuable to three world religions, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and represents the transition point between the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene, the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of the Farming Age, the end of the Late Epipaleolithic Period and the beginning of the pre-pottery Neolithic Period, and the origins of civilization.